This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative. More about them and their new gaming mats later on. The Imperial Fists are one of the many Space Marine chapters represented in Warhammer 40,000's 10th edition. Traditionally, they are focused on siege warfare and superlative marksmanship, able to mount staunch defenses of choke points and wither down enemies in fusillades of highly accurate bolter fire. Today we're going to be talking about constructing an Imperial Fists army for 40k. We're going to be moving from the new Imperial Fists Combat Patrol all the way up through a Strike Force game, and we're going to be talking about this using primarily the Imperial Fists Specialist Detachment, the Emperor's Shield. Now, Imperial Fists are an option of a Space Marine chapter. For a little bit of context, the Space Marine faction in 40k is one of the only ones that uses a sub-faction mechanic. This means that when you choose to construct a Space Marine army, you'll choose not only the Adeptus Astartes faction keyword during list construction, but also a Space Marine chapter keyword, in this case Imperial Fists. This unlocks special detachments to be played that are available to only that chapter, in this case the Emperor's Shield detachment, as well as special characters. And these characters will often have transformative effects on particular units that are played within the army. Imperial Fists have access to two special characters, these being Tor Garadon and Darnath Lysander, and we'll discuss including them in the army as we go through. Once you've selected a chapter keyword, all other chapter keywords are locked to you, so Imperial Fists cannot be fielded in the same army alongside things like Ultramarine or Black Templars. I should note, however, that Imperial Fists do have their own successor chapter within this mechanic, that being Crimson Fists, which are represented by Pedro Cantor. If Pedro Cantor is included in your army, despite the fact that he shares the Imperial Fist keyword, you cannot include any other Imperial Fist special characters, such as Lysander or Tor Garadon. However, you can play him in the Emperor's Shield detachment, which is restricted to Imperial Fist armies. Now with that, let's discuss the Space Marine core mechanics momentarily, because they're gonna feature quite heavily in our discussion of the Emperor's Shield detachment. Space Marines are an elite force of shock troopers, dispatched to hot zones of anti-Imperial resistance in order to destroy specific targets. This is represented in the game by Oaths of Moment, their army ability, which will allow them to select a unit to gain hit rerolls and +1 to wound against, with all of the attacks targeting that unit. This will oftentimes, as we'll discuss when we move over to the list building section, unlock special abilities for some specific units as well, that they will gain when targeting that Oath of Moment target. This video is sponsored by Lighter Creative. Now, I've already talked about Lighter Creative on this channel in the past, and their cool and innovative mats as well as WTC-compatible terrain systems. But what they want me to talk to you about today is their updates to their battle mat system. Now, Lighter Creative uses this vinyl-style battle mat. It's a textured material with a felt backing, which makes it super-duper nice on your tabletop. While this is lighter than neoprene, it comes with a ton of advantages, including the fact that it can be folded up rather than requiring it to be rolled, because it won't crack and smooths out really easily once you lay it out on the tabletop. Lighter Creative previously created battle mats that were compatible for use with Warhammer 40k, including printed deployment zones and objective markers, and I'm happy to report that they have expanded their selection of these styles of mats, now including new designs. However, they also now have mats that are compatible with multiple game systems. This one, for example, this is a Kelty mat. It's a little baby guy. That's pretty cool, right? They also have less sci-fi themed designs if you're looking for something that's compatible with more of a fantasy game. That said, the Warhammer 40,000 mats do have a ton of advantages. They retain those cool deployment zone and objective marker printouts, as well as including a measurement grid, now with marked sections on the battlefield, so you can actually see very easily where things like your deployment zones or table quarters actually line up. This looks like such an incredible improvement in play experience and makes it easier to score out your objectives, in addition to kind of looking like a battlefield overlay, which is kind of sweet. So check out these mats in the links in the video description. If you're looking to grind games competitively, there's no better mat for you. Starting our discussion with the Imperial Fists Combat Patrol, I always recommend that players begin with Combat Patrols in order to get a handle on a new faction and as an easy starting place for their army. This is a new release and comes with kind of an eccentric smorgasbord of models. This includes units of intercessors as well as heavy intercessors, 5 of each of those, not quite enough to make a full squad. We have a company hero squad alongside a captain. Now, company heroes are a unit that requires captains to attach within them, so we are going to need to keep both of those units together if we're going to retain them in the list, as well as a unit of Terminators. Now, as we move on to talk about larger incarnations of the Emperor's Shield, these Terminators are going to become absolutely invaluable. The downside here is that the heavy intercessors are a little bit of an odd inclusion. While standard intercessors are a good backline objective holder and good for performing utility duties, heavy intercessors are kind of in an odd spot. They're significantly more expensive than many of the other lighter varieties of infantry, and they are meant to kind of be these big bulwarky tanks, but don't fulfill the role quite as well as other units such as Terminators, and additionally don't attach a lot of the characters that can really make them shine. So they're in a little bit of a strange spot here. Now with that, we're going to move over to talk about the Emperor's Shield detachment as we discuss about moving this army into an incursion level game plan, which is roughly doubling the size of the combat patrol army. Now in this case, we choose a detachment. In this case, we're going to play the only Imperial Fist specific detachment, and this detachment is focused extremely heavily on getting use out of units like veterans as well as Terminator squads. Now for that reason, the Terminator squads included in the combat patrol are going to be fairly useful, and we can focus a lot of the remainder of the army on veteran units like Blade Guard and Vanguard. Now the detachment ability gives you an enhanced Oaths of Moment. When you target your Oath of Moment target as a baseline, you get reroll hit rolls. Imperial Fists are what's called Codex compliant. That gives them +1 to wound against their Oath of Moment target as well. And the detachment also gives them reroll 1s to wound. So you'll choose an enemy unit on each of your turns and will get massive damage output increases against that unit. Now there's an additional clause inside this ability which gives you full rerolls, that's hit and wound, if your unit contains Darnath Lysander. So we're going to start by utilizing this special ability and including Lysander in the list. Now Lysander is a fairly interesting character. He's a Terminator, so he'll attach into our squad of Terminators that we're bringing, and he brings one of the most powerful melee weapons in the Space Marine arsenal. This is the Fist of Dor and his relic Thunderhammer, which is a Strength 10 AP3 3 damage melee weapon. In comparison to many other melee profiles and similar characters, this is incredibly strong. On top of that, Darnath is also going to be getting that benefit when he targets his Oath of the Moment target, giving him +1 to wound, meaning he's wounding most targets in the game on 3s or maybe 4s, and getting reroll hits and wound rolls. In addition, he also has his Icon of Obstinacy, which reduces enemy damage by giving enemy attacks -1 to wound if the strength of the attack is equal to or greater than the toughness characteristic of his unit. Importantly, this works on Lysander whether or not he's leading a unit, which is very unique for our abilities like this. It means that if any strength 5 or higher weapon targets his unit of Terminators, it's going to be -1 to wound. So you can never wound his unit on better than a 3, and you can only get to a 3 to wound if you are strength 10 or have wound benefits of your own in order to ignore this penalty. This makes Lysander's unit of Terminators incredibly difficult to engage with, and on top of that, it also makes them deal a ton of damage because of that reroll that they gain from the detachment ability. Now, as we move on to an incursion level game, we can see that we are going to be taking full advantage of this, and within the Emperor's Shield detachment, there are a ton of really powerful benefits that we can apply to things like Terminator squads, which we're going to be making the most use of that we can. So we are going to expand the base army by adding an additional 5 Terminators to this list, as well as an Impulsor on top of Lysander. As I mentioned before, the captain that's included in the combat patrol must be attached with the company hero squad. If the company hero squad has no attachment, it actually kills itself before the game, so those two units are basically locked together. Now, unfortunately, they don't have any explicit synergy within this detachment. However, the Space Marine captain is always a useful inclusion. He himself has a once per game ability to improve his own damage output in melee, so he's going to be a unit that we can use the company hero squad to deliver, and he can act as kind of a mid-board bully. The Impulsor is going to be included because it can carry that unit to the fight, so we're going to use it as a little bit of a delivery system for the captain. It's also just a useful unit to have. You typically equip these things with a shield dome unless you have any particular reason to take one of the other turret-mounted weapons. That makes it kind of difficult to kill. It's relatively fast, and you can kind of throw it away to do utility stuff and score points. From there, we have this big unit of 10 Terminators. Now, these are going to be the standard bolter-equipped Terminators, and I recommend you equip them all with Power Fists as their backups. Now, we're going to be taking 2 sets of Cyclone missile launchers in the unit as well. That's also important because we're going to be doing a lot of their damage from range. The detachment actually, when it's fully comboed out, can actually get some crazy damage from these guys' ranged attacks. Largely, what we're going to be trying to do with this army is spreading around the table with our lighter units before bullying the middle of the table with a huge Terminator squad that's incredibly difficult to kill, thanks to Lysander. The detachment also has stratagems such as Fury of the First, which will even make these Terminators more dangerous if they've taken any casualties. Now, this army is going to play in an incredibly straightforward manner. You want your intercessors to begin the game on your home objective. They have the objective secured ability, which means that if they hold an objective at the start of your turn, they lock it in under your control, and it remains under your control until your opponent comes and takes it. So if they don't have any deep striking effects or fast units that can come and touch that objective, the intercessors can lock it and then simply move on. In subsequent turns, if you have your Impulsor around, they can even hop into the Impulsor and use its firing deck. We also have the Heavy Intercessors. Now, one of the reasons I say that the Heavy Intercessors are kind of an odd unit out is that they cannot embark into the Impulsor because they are Gravis keyworded, and they're a little bit too large to actually embark in a lot of the Gravis transports that the faction has. And on top of that, they're also slower than the standard Intercessors, so it's very difficult to get them into a position where they're going to be relevant. Now, what we want to do is sort of set them off across from the closest objective and just try to get them there as early as possible. They can act as a utility and kind of a bulwark to lock that down. Although obviously they do have to actually make it all the way over there. That can be a little bit tough, but once they're there, they can put down some pretty serious fire with their heavy bolt rifles, which are multi-damage, which is very nice. On top of that, we also have the company hero squad with the captain, who is going to be a difficult squad to engage with for most enemies. We're going to put them in the Impulsor and try to get them in a position towards the center of the table where they can do what's called staging. So what we want to do is essentially get them into an area like this. This is a ruin, so it will block all incoming lines of sight against units that are not inside the area of the ruin. So the Impulsor can simply stand here, and when the time comes for this unit to engage, they can be disembarked 3 inches away from it, as long as they're wholly within that 3 inches. So we can, for example, just place them somewhere out like this, and then use that disembarkation to give them a little bit of extra quote-unquote movement up the table. They can move up the table, and they can charge enemies that are going to try to fight you over the middle. So specifically the middle objective, or enemies that are trying to screen out your Terminator drop. Now, the reason I talk about that is because we're going to keep these Terminators in deep strike. Either we're going to start them on the table and then use the dropship extraction stratagem to put them into reserve to then allow them to deep strike elsewhere on the table later, or we're going to begin the game in reserve. It depends on usually how aggressive your opponent is, but generally speaking, I would keep them in reserve to start with. And if you notice that your opponent has like a ton of units that can screen them, maybe you can start them in a position where they can't get shot and they can just peek out and shoot enemy light infantry if they have like a lot of guardsmen or cultists or things like that will run out and try to stop them from getting good deep strikes elsewhere. Then you can start them on the table and then use the dropship extraction later, or you can just start them in reserve and deep strike them normally. Now, here's an interesting thing to note about the Terminator squad. They have the teleport Homer war gear option, which allows you to place a Homer marker somewhere on the table and use that as a free rapid ingress as long as you go 3 inches away from that marker. I don't have a teleport Homer marker handy, so I'm just going to use this little yellow token here. But you set that up before the game begins. It's important to note that it doesn't require that you use the token to arrive from rapid ingress. It simply makes your rapid ingress free if you do end up using the token. While it is expended when it's used, it doesn't actually require that your unit start in reserve. So if you do something like use dropship extraction to put the unit into reserve, you can then rapid ingress them later on over the course of the game. Now, rapid ingress is probably one of the most powerful stratagems in 40k. It allows a unit in reserve to come out of reserve during your opponent's turn to then move and charge and act normally on the subsequent turn. What you want to do is identify areas of terrain like this or like this where your unit can hide relatively safely and place the marker somewhere around there. Now, there's an additional little benefit that you can kind of extract from this, which is the fact that the unit only has to be within 3 inches of the marker. It doesn't have to be wholly within. So only one of the models in the unit needs to be next to that marker to get the benefit of it. The rest of them can kind of string out wherever you want. Now, typically what you want to do is save this token for a situation where your opponent is moving forward but doesn't have very strong lines of sight to where the token is, and you want to be able to counterattack them. So you can ensure that while you place your unit at the end of their movement phase, if they don't have line of sight to you at that stage, they won't be able to shoot you at all because their army has theoretically already moved unless they have some special abilities, which allows you to keep that unit safe. So for example, if we have a ranged attacker here and we use our teleport homer to drop the unit over here. That ranged attacker would not have line of sight to the Terminator unit. The Terminators are then free to move out and attack and then charge like normal later. The other thing that we can do, if your opponent doesn't give you any good opportunities to do that, is once you have cleared away your opponent's screening units, light units that your opponent doesn't really care about, that they want to throw in the way of these Terminators to make sure that you can't drop on their more important stuff. It might take you a turn or two to get rid of those with the Intercessors and the Company Heroes and the Heavy Intercessors. Once you do that, however, you can drop these guys normally 9 inches away from enemies using the Deep Strike rule, but you want everybody to be within 12 inches of them to get rapid fire on their Storm Bolters. Now, once that's done, and it's important to note that Lysander himself, it's a little bit funny that he joins a ranged unit because he actually does not have a ranged attack himself, but once you have dropped these guys into the fray, let's talk about exactly how much damage they do and why they're so important to Imperial Fists in 10th edition. Now, the first thing is obviously once they're attached with Lysander inside Imperial Emperor's Shield, they're going to be getting full hit and wound rerolls when they target their Oath of Moment target. The Imperial Fist will also give them +1 to wound, and Terminators get +1 to hit when they target their Oath of Moment target to begin with. So they're going to be hitting most targets on 2s, wounding almost everything in the game on 5s or better with full hit and wound rerolls. With 40 shots plus 4 Cyclone Missile Launchers, that's already really good. However, we have a couple stratagems that are very useful here. If you are trying to get damage through any attack modifiers that your opponent has, so -1 to hit or wound that they have, you can use Fury of the First to give you yourself an additional +1 to hit. Obviously, it doesn't stack to better than +1. However, if your opponent has a bunch of -1s to hit, you can use that to counteract that. On top of that, it also has a +1 to wound clause as well. Typically, what we'll do is use this in melee once the unit has started to take damage because it makes them much stronger in melee. However, we can also use it in the early game if they have suffered a casualty already. On top of that, we also have Disciplined Extermination. This gives a veteran squad, Terminators or Sternguard veterans are going to be the big use cases of this, ignore cover and +1 AP. So this brings all of those Stormbolters to AP1 ignore cover, so they're going to be forcing enemy units like Space Marines onto a 4+ save regardless of their cover status. It's going to put your Cyclone Missile Launchers to AP3 ignore cover, so most enemies will be saving on 6s or on their invulnerable save, whatever they have. So this unit, if let's say we're attacking an opposing toughness 4 infantry unit, something like an opposing Space Marine, the unit has a very strong chance to convert 100% of its hits, closer to 80 or 90% of its wound rolls, so you're probably handing your opponent 35 saves, let's say, and those saves are going to be on best a 4+ if they're saving on 3s innately, which means a 3+ save toughness 4-ish enemy is going to be handed somewhere around 17 or 18 damage from the bolters alone. You then can also do something similar with the Cyclone Missile Launchers, either just straight up probably killing 4 guys or handing them a bunch of 1 damage saves from the frag missiles fired from those Cyclone Missile Launchers. The output from this unit is actually crazy, and it even works against heavier targets. Let's assume that the bolters are wounding on 6s innately. Once you've added all this stuff together, they start to wound on 5s. You should hit basically 100% of your attacks. Your bolters wounding on 5s with full rerolls converts about 50% of the attacks into wounds, so you're handing your opponent about 20 saves, and the Cyclone Missile Launchers should hand your opponent about 3 more AP3 saves for D6 damage each. So most targets, if they don't have any invulnerable saves or AP reduction effects, will suffer somewhere around 10-ish damage from the bolters alone, and then probably another 10 or 12 from the Cyclone Missile Launchers. Obviously, there's a lot of dice occurring there, but it goes to show you that once you use this stratagem and this combination of effects, targeting their Oath of Moment target with Lysander attached, this unit will come in and basically kill one of almost anything in the game. They're good for about 20 damage into heavy targets, and they're good to kill probably 10 or so Space Marines. From there, they also get all these benefits in melee. You can also use Fury of the First for hit bonuses and wound bonuses when you're in melee, and Lysander obviously loves to be in melee as well. He also has a once per game 2+ invulnerable save, so once the unit gets charged, you can use that, and if the Terminators themselves get laid low, which again is very difficult because they are extremely resilient with Lysander inside them, he can use his 2+ invulnerable save and then try to tank that and ensure that he gets his attacks back. You can also use Obdurate Vengeance when you're charged to try to fight on death as well. It does eat a lot of command points, but once this unit's on the table, it can start to use stratagems like Wrathful Conquerors to use objectives secured on even more objectives, and then push forward basically for the win. The goal here is to skirmish for a turn or two with our other little units, and then use rapid ingress or a standard deep strike to bring these guys onto the board, and then basically just clear out the whole middle of the table of enemies, and then use your huge brick of 10 Terminators to push forward and start to take over the other objectives. I think it's also important to note that Lysander has a baseline +1 OC bonus for all of your Terminator units, so they're actually going to be OC2, so it's very easy to take objectives with them. But from there, it's time to move on and talk about some larger games using this style of list. And this is where things get a little bit interesting, because what I want to do in this series is at all times try to guide you into a list that is going to have a lot of utility outside of just this one detachment. And while I do think that there are a lot of really powerful, really cool lists that you can play inside Emperor's Shield, building a list that is within Emperor's Shield that uses the contents of the combat patrol in a way that allows you to make use of all of your units is a little bit tricky. So now moving over to Strike Force games. This was a 2,000 point game level that represents about a doubling of the size of the Incursion games that we just discussed. And as you can see, in this case, we've expanded a lot of the list range output as well as a lot of their utility options, their ability to range out and perform actions. Now, in a little bit of a first on this series, I've actually removed some things from the list. Now, I try not to do this in this series because obviously you want to be using the models that you have purchased and spend time assembling and painting. And especially if you're getting started in a game like list optimization, like little trades out and stuff don't typically make that much of a difference. But in the interest of not encouraging people to get additional units that they might not necessarily be using in the future, I have actually suggested a couple of minor swaps here. Now, the big one is the company heroes. Because they're not a veteran unit, they may have much use inside Emperor's Shield. However, in other lists, they're very good. So you keep the unit around, but inside Emperor's Shield, you don't necessarily need them. What we want is Blade Guard veterans, which are great. They're a melee focused unit, relatively resilient. They have a 4+ invulnerable save Storm Shield, and they're veterans, so they get all the cool stratagem. However, we want some characters for them. So we have the captain from the Combat Patrol, which we can use, and we also would like a Blade Guard Ancient. However, what we can do is just take the Ancient from the Company Hero Squad and use him instead. And that means we can have an Ancient without necessarily having to go out and buy explicitly the Blade Guard Ancient, which in my opinion is a little expensive for a unit that does not get very much use. So we can just swap out the Banner Bearer from the Company Heroes and use him instead. And that will leave 3 Company Heroes winning in the wings. We can save those guys, and then you'll certainly use them in army lists later on. Company Heroes are an incredibly versatile unit in a variety of different detachments. So it's not like you're not going to get use out of that unit regardless. So what have we added to this army? Now, obviously the core, the sort of combo of the army is going to be Darneth Lysander and his big Terminator brick here. We also have some additional powerful abilities from our other characters. Now, the big one is going to be the Maladraxian Standard, which is an enhancement inside Emperor's Shield. And this is the reason that we need an Ancient. It can only be assigned to Ancients. It's a banner that gets carried by the character model himself. And it gives a slightly worse version of Lysander's leadership ability to whatever unit the Ancient is in. So that's why we have a Blade Guard Ancient here, because he can join into a Blade Guard Veteran Squad. Now, the Blade Guard Veterans are really cool. They have a built-in reroll once to hit effect that they can choose to activate at the start of the fight phase, and they are affectable by Fury of the First, the stratagem that we talked about earlier to get +1 to hit and +1 to wound if you are already below starting strength, which means that if you're rerolling your ones to hit and the unit is +1 to hit, it's probably hitting 100% of its hit rolls, and you can get it +1 to wound if it's taken any casualties before it gets stuck into the fight. So this unit by itself can actually be relatively resilient with the -1 to be wounded plus a 4+ invulnerable save and then hit fairly hard. And those effects will also apply to the captain, who will give you use of that stratagem for free. And a lot of the stuff we already talked about, things like being able to fight on death, those are all available also to the Blade Guard veterans in addition to the Terminators. Now, the captain is also kind of a nice inclusion. He can dual attach alongside a Ancient into the unit, as long as it's a captain or a chapter master alongside an Ancient. You can put 2 characters into the same squad. That allows you to double up on your enhancements. The Blade Guard Ancient has a once per game ability that adds +1 attack to everything in the unit. And if we wanted to, we can also use Champion of the Feast to give the captain an almost identical ability, which also gives him +1 attack and a once per game +1 attack to his whole unit, which allows you to either sustain out these extra attack bonuses for a longer period of time. So if the Blade Guard are in a protracted combat, you can sustain +1 attack multiple times. Or if you just want to hammer blow something and try to kill it right off the bat, you can use both of them and give them +2 attacks. So the base unit would be up to 6 attacks per model once per game. That's an insane amount of damage, especially when you consider that basically all of those attacks are going to hit, and then we're going to be winning on 5s or so. Maybe rerolling killing ones if we have the Oath of Moment targeted as well. So it's a lot of potential damage, especially against stuff that's below toughness 10. Then these guys absolutely scythe. But the combination of the -1 to be wounded effects from the standard and the multiple +1 attack effects to make this unit incredibly powerful. Now, the downside is that it is 8 transport capacity, so in order to build a transport for it, we need to have a repulsor. The unit's too large to put into an impulsor, the smaller transport, so we're going to use that for a different unit over here. But a repulsor brings some anti-tank shooting, a little bit of anti-infantry shooting as well, and gives you a big unit that we can put those guys in to deliver them up the table. In a pinch, you can also, if you have a couple points, probably 60 to 80 points, depending on the variety that you want, you can swap this guy out for a Land Raider as well, which is basically do all the same stuff. It just is harder to kill and does more damage. The repulsor is just a very inexpensive variety. It's basically up to dealer's choice. And as I do with all of these army lists in these videos now, I have left a couple of points at the end. So if you have any swaps that you would like to do or any additional enhancements you want to take, then there is points for those. Also, if the list changes in the future, then there will be space in case any of these units get nerfed. So from there, we are also going to be taking a bunch of utility squads. We're taking 2 units of Vanguard veterans. Now, these are firstborn jump pack infantry. They come with storm shields as an option, so that gives them a 4+ invulnerable save. They're more resilient than things like jump pack intercessors. And the other thing too for Emperor's Shield is that they are veterans, so you can use all the veteran stats. So there's strats on them: +1 to hit, +1 to wound, objective securing objectives. Those are all available for these guys, which is a huge deal because these are going to be where a lot of your scoring comes from. Speaking of scoring, we also have a unit of scouts, which are just going to jump up in front of our army and score some objectives, as well as a unit of incursors. Now, the incursors, I think, are what we're going to use for the impulsor for right now, because they have the scout ability that gives them a move before the game begins. So after deployment is complete and after the first round has been determined, these guys are going to be able to move 6 inches. If they are inside a dedicated transport, like the impulsor, then they can also move the transport itself. So it gives basically 2 units that can scoot up the table in order to take table space or to score objectives in the early game. Now, what we want to be doing for the most part is utilizing Oaths of Moment on the things that we want to hit with either the big brick units, like the Terminators or the Blade Guard veterans. The Oath of Moment is going to give you the best bang for your buck, especially when you're using Darnath Lysander's synergies with it. So we want to save the targeting of that ability for whatever they're going to attack. That means that our other guns, like the Repulsor and the Vindicators, aren't necessarily going to have quite as much support from the army. They're going to need some help in terms of accuracy. Now, the Incursors can give +1 to hit against the unit that they shoot with their guns. There's also, I think, if you have some additional points in here, then you could include a Tech Marine as well in exchange for the Incursors, which does a similar thing. You're going to give +1 to hit to the vehicles. So that's another option that's available to you. There's a couple of swaps that could be done to this army, just based on player preference. So we have these Vindicators. These are very high resilient, very Imperial Fist pilled frontline units that are going to be able to deal some massive damage to stuff in direct line of sight. These guys are going to get buffed by the Incursors for +1 to hit, and they're just going to blast away by themselves. They don't really need that much support, whereas we're going to be using all of our stratagems and our Oaths of Moment to affect things like the Terminator squads or the Blade Guard veterans. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the battlefield, one thing that it's going to do is it's going to make a lot of use of transport mechanics. One thing that I recommend you do, and this is actually a little bit of a little piece of technology you can utilize in most of your lists, is start the heavy intercessors inside the repulsor. This is because as soon as the game begins, you're going to get the opportunity to disembark them. And as we talked about in the Incursion game, when delivering units like the company heroes from the impulsor, that's going to give them a little boost of movement. They can disembark 3 inches in front of the repulsor and then simply just move on to go to our objectives. So you can see that, whereas previously they would have needed to roll a pretty high advance in order to get onto an objective in the middle of the table in the Incursion game mode, if you're disembarking them from a unit like the Repulsor, they don't have to roll that advance at all. You can then start the Blade Guard veterans who actually want to be delivered by the Repulsor on the table, and before the Repulsor moves, just embark them into it immediately. And then the Repulsor can move up, and we can do the same thing that we talked about previously, where we try to get into a position where it can stage, and it's going to be able to get those melee units into a position where it can fight in the late game or it can fight over the middle of the table. The Impulsor, you're going to want to embark the Incursors into. That gives it scout, so it's going to also be able to move up to a position like this before the game begins, whether that's up here or behind a wall or something similar where you can use it more aggressively later on. That's just a nice bonus to have, and then we can use this to either house units like the Incursors or the Intercessors, or we can use it to act as a utility unit and go score objectives and do things by itself. We have a similar thing that we are going to do with the Vanguard veterans. They can move up and they can attack enemy objective, or they can move up to try to score some points. Now, these guys, they like I said before, they do have an invulnerable save. So oftentimes what you'll try to do is, let's say you have an objective that tells you to go perform an action in an area of the table. You want to put one model out into an aggressive spot like that, keep the rest of the models behind line of sight. And when your opponent attacks, you want to create a situation where you're only going to lose 1 or 2 models from the unit. And then these guys, the remainder, because it's difficult to one-shot a unit of 5 Space Marines with an invuln save, the remainder will likely stay alive to then be used to do something else in the future. So these guys, the benefit of this unit is because they have those storm shields, they can oftentimes be used as kind of 2 units together because they're going to be absorbing 1 attack and then moving forward and pushing forward past that. We can also deep strike them if you want to, so you can keep 1 unit in reserve, for example, and then deep strike it later on or use rapid ingress on it, whatever you want to do. That's also definitely useful. We have the Space Marine Scouts in the center here. They're going to give you some capacity to score points on turn 1, so they have both Infiltrate and Scout, so they can set up anywhere on the battlefield that's 9 inches away from enemy models or the enemy deployment zone. And then just like the Incursors and the Impulsor we talked about, they can just scout as soon as the game begins to either go into a defensive position, so like behind a line of sight blocker, like this ruin wall here, or they can use that to move forward and then give themselves either a position where they can block enemies from moving, they can score objectives themselves, or they can set up to, for example, attack this objective and keep your opponent off balance, depending on whether you go first or second. So they're a very good unit. Because this army is not super fast, it does have a lot of reserve mechanics and teleporting and stuff like that. Having a unit that can push up into the center of the table in the early game allows you to interact with your opponent before your Vanguard veterans and your transports can get there. Now, generally speaking, and this depends a lot on the matchup and the terrain, and you'll learn as you play more games when this is appropriate, but I generally speak encourage players to keep at least 1 ranged element in reserve, in addition to the Terminator squad, which is going to be deep striking around. Having a Vindicator in reserve forces your opponent to consider a Vindicator popping off 6 inches off a table edge. These guys just use regular strat reserve rules, so they have to be wholly within 6 inches of a table edge, and they can't go in your opponent's deployment zone until battle round 3. Forcing your opponent to consider those means that they always have to push forward things to screen and stop you from just hopping this guy over on the table and getting a really powerful shot like into their back line or something where they don't really want him to be. But obviously, any of these units in reserve, consider rapid ingress at all times. So if there's ever a position where you can rapid ingress this guy, for example, behind this terrain feature, where he's in line of sight to him is being blocked, and then he can just move out over it on your subsequent turn and get shots into wherever your opponent might not be expecting, always keep those in mind. So having those tactics available to you is always super helpful. And that's one of the reasons that I encourage people to put some manner of ranged attacking units into reserve. But obviously, this list is going to use reserves quite a bit. Fortunately, we do have the Vindicators will help, and the Repulsor as well is good at clearing out those infantry units that your opponent's going to screen with. So as you have all this stuff in reserve, your opponent's going to push units forward to try to restrict where they can set up. You're going to kill them with these high volume attack units, and then in round 3 onwards or so, you're going to drop these guys on the table. Don't forget their teleport homer we talked about in the incursion section. They're going to combo out against the Oath of Moment target, do a ton of damage, and then we're going to be able to push behind that with things like the Repulsor, use the Blade Guard veterans as a late game anchor, and push out a victory from there. But that is, in a nutshell, how this list operates in the Strike Force game mode. And that is, of course, my tutorial on Imperial Fists. Now, I will say there's a bunch of ways to expand this list. Emperor's Shield is the only detachment that is explicitly built for Imperial Fists. However, you can play any of the other Codex Space Marine detachments with Imperial Fists just fine. So there's a lot of ways to expand. This list in particular, there are other units that you can include. The melee Terminators with the combos for -1 to be wounded and bonus attacks, I think, in my opinion, is great. If you don't necessarily want to play Blade Guard veterans, they are very narrow in use case, though. Outside of this detachment, Terminators themselves are not that amazing, so I don't recommend it right off the bat. You just go all in on a billion Terminators. But if you do like the profile and you like the models, then it might be a way to consider constructing your army. You can also move into things like Stern Guard veterans as another example of a unit that's pretty good with a lot of these combos. They do a lot more damage at range, so they can act as kind of a backup to the Terminator squad, where you use all the strats and the powerful combos on the Terminator squad. They go kill something, and then as they get engaged in melee and they can't shoot anymore, and Lysander gets stuck in, then you can bring in a Stern Guard veteran squad in Pulsar or a Drop Pod maybe, and they can hop in and do something very similar as well. So there's a lot of different ways to build Emperor's Shield. And then on top of that, there's also ways to build into other detachments, like Gladius Task Force is the primary example, because you can kind of build however you want to from there. And what I've tried to do is encourage the use of units that will be usable in those other detachments. detachments. Blade Guard veterans, Vindicators, a lot of this utility stuff is always useful in almost any list you play. So regardless of your detachment, you're going to be able to find good use cases for those models. But the world's your oyster when it comes to Space Marines. Space Marines, the largest build flexibility, build variety of any faction in 40k, and you can kind of do whatever you want with them. So there's really no wrong answers. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, Lighter Creative for sponsoring this video, and everyone who supports over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.